Apologies, we're a couple of minutes late, a few technical issues this end, but I think we're all up and running. So welcome to Isoropia's Live, and today we're going to be looking at boundaries and setting boundaries, and how important boundaries are not only for our mental well-being, but in lots of aspects or different aspects of our life. So just before we go on to that, I'd like to do a very quick introduction. My name's Neil. I'm known as Neil S. We have a number of Neils, and we have a lot of other people that have the same names in our office. And with me today is April. So we've been doing a little bit of work in the background on this subject. So hopefully today you're going to be getting involved with us. So just a couple of elements that you're aware. We are actually streaming on YouTube, I believe, and Facebook. So you do have the option to put up any comments. So if there's anything that you'd like to pose or a question you'd like to ask myself or April, then by all means do that. But please be aware that when you post that, other people that are watching this podcast, if you want to call it, will see your comments. So if you just feel that that might not be something you want to do, it's just an awareness for you. So what's Isorapia all about? If you haven't heard of us before, then we are a very person-centered organization that help people out with their mental health struggles. We're not kind of therapists, and we're certainly not medically trained, although I'm not myself. We do have some medically trained staff within our organization, but the people like myself and April, we come from the same place as a lot of people that we find, and that's through kind of lived experience. We've kind of had these struggles in our lifestyles, and we've managed to kind of empower ourselves to get to a better place from a mental health point of view. So as I said, today we're going to be talking around boundary setting. So your input will be really important. Your comments will come up, and we are able to see them here, and we will try and keep up with those. And if there's anything that we feel that we can actually add something to, then we'll try our very best to do that. So as I said, it's going to be set around boundaries, and we've set a couple of questions just for myself and April, and we've done a little bit of research around these things, and we've kind of identified, especially from our own experiences, how important boundaries are. So we'll get started. We'll probably run this for about 30 minutes, but if it takes a little bit longer and we get a good input from you guys, it will take as long as it takes. So April, what are boundaries all about?
So I think there are imaginary lines that separate me from you, really. We formulate these boundaries. There are 3 different types. There's a rigid boundary, which is something that you strongly believe in. It's a boundary that you set, and you don't really want to move from it.
Okay, so it's really rigid, and if somebody oversteps, that's when problems are created.
Precisely. It's if you have a belief, say for instance, somebody's being a racist or they're being homophobic, you're going to be rigid with that boundary, and you're going to say, no, that you're overstepping that now. You're making me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of boundary.
Yeah, I get you on that one.
Yeah. And then there's the porous boundary, which is a bit more flexible. So that could be, for instance, you're asked to work late, and it's unfortunate, but you can be flexible. But if that was to become a common occurrence, then, that could then breed resentment and anger. So that's, but it is a boundary that you're aware of, that if it's overstepped.
Oh, okay. So I'm kind of getting where you're coming from. So there are boundaries that you really don't want people to overstep, but then you've also got to have that element of flexibility in there, because although it can be something that you're able to do, but you don't want to do it all of the time. I love the around the work thing, because that kind of connects with me as well. Sometimes things happen, do they not, where you do have to be flexible from time to time, but you're not going to be doing that and kind of overstepping your boundary regularly.
No, I suppose it's having an awareness that when that breeds resentment, that's when you really need to start maybe moving it more into that rigid side of a boundary. And then the final boundary is a healthy boundary. So we need healthy boundaries. You know, that these they're pretty much to maintain your mental health and well-being, really. And healthy boundaries are set to make sure that you remain mentally and emotionally stable, basically. And they can help you sort of during recovery from alcohol or drug addiction, things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that kind of lends itself to when you talk about sort of alcohol addiction or drug addiction, you know, it's creating something a bit more healthier in your life and resetting your boundaries effectively. Is that where you're coming from on that one?
Yeah, you have to set those healthy boundaries because it's going to be detrimental otherwise to your recovery. So it's a really important boundary to have. So boundaries can also tell people how they can treat you. Otherwise, you know, this is a healthy boundary. Otherwise, people can just overstep, you know, your beliefs and things like that. So yeah.
And we're going to talk a little bit later, aren't we, about, you know, when people overstep your boundary and how you can actually kind of communicate that more effectively.
Yeah, the effective communication is so important, you know, remaining clear and kind always. So when you clearly communicate your boundaries, people know they're expected to behave in a certain way. Otherwise, your resentment can grow, especially in relationships.
Oh, yeah.
You know, if people's overstepping your boundaries, then what's going to happen to you on a personal level? You know, it's going to become toxic in your relationship.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Yeah. You know, I can think of certain situations in probably both our lives.
Oh, crikey, yeah.
I think it is certainly a skill that, especially when you're unwell, that you're not really aware of how important boundary setting is. And when you're talking about relationships, I think it's vital in relationships, whether that be with a partner or whether it be with an intimate relationship. It's also important with family and
massively.
Friends and everything, isn't it?
Yeah, it's such an important aspect of that because it can be the cause of a breakdown between your relationship or a family member, can't it?
Yeah.
It can actually breed that. So it's so important to recognise when you have to, you know, just consider those boundary making techniques. Yeah, so we're going to look at techniques later.
Well, I would just today, we were having a meeting this morning, weren't we? And you kind of communicated a boundary so effectively, but the thing that kind of captured me was that boundary was accepted by everybody that was in our meeting, and you stuck to that yourself.
Yeah.
And when we're talking in a minute about communicating that boundary, I was actually quite proud and impressed with you, because we got to a point where you said, I have to have time for my own well-being. I need to get out in the sunshine, and I am entitled to take some time out. So just to let you guys know, I am taking this time out. And did you feel better as a result of that?
Incredibly better. And I didn't feel guilt because I communicated it, you know, because when you communicate on a level, you know, you're telling your colleagues, I need this, you know, this is important for me. They're going to understand it, aren't they? And the impact that has on you can be enormous.
And one thing that, you know, not just from what happened today, for instance, one thing that I've realized now that I'm able to set boundaries, that invariably a lot of people, once they understand your boundary, are kind of accepting of it quite regularly, are they not?
They are, and they recognize when you need, you know, they need to be really conscious about that boundary as well. Yeah, and you recognize it in yourself as well, which is, it's so important, I believe.
So that links back to the reason why you have to have healthy boundaries for your own well-being, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly that.
That's great. Yeah, that's interesting, that is.
It is.
Well, a little bit of praise about setting your boundary today. And sticking with it.
It's in all aspects of life, though, isn't it? It could be like coming home and having to do the washing up every day. It's going to create resentment and anger, and it's going to create a tension in your family home. So you know, knowing when you need to communicate. Hang on a minute, guys. Can you please just help me here? You know, it's just going to relieve that tension. It's so important.
So that really answers that question, doesn't it? Why is it important to have boundaries? There's all different elements, like April's explained there. I like the way that she's broken it down into certain aspects. So we'll go for the next question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So what boundaries are important to protect ourselves?
So I've written some lists here, and so these are the types of boundaries that are really important to have awareness about. So, for instance, like physical boundaries, that's if, for instance, you're in your workspace and somebody might, touch you and it feels uncomfortable, that can be overstepping your boundary. So a physical boundary, and having awareness of what's appropriate and what's not, and then how you communicate that to another person, it'll bring awareness to them and yourself. But it's a really good reminder to always think clear and kind communication with that.
That's an interesting thing, because that's just flickered into my head when you're talking about personal boundaries. I've found myself in situations, I'm not sure, where you kind of have that line, if you like. It's an invisible line, but when somebody oversteps it, you become a little bit vulnerable. I'm thinking about situations where I've gone to parties, or I've gone into a pub or something like that, and somebody gets a bit too close to you. They're not being horrible in any way, shape or form, but it makes you feel a little bit under pressure, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's going to be different from me and you, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
With certain people, they have their own sort of idea about what boundaries are for them, so it's always going to be different for each individual.
Yeah, that's a good point, that one.
Yeah, it is. And then another one, it's intellectual boundaries, and that's like your thoughts and ideas. We sort of touched on it earlier, didn't we, about racism and sort of homophobia and things like that. That you can feel violated if somebody diminishes that. So formulating sort of intellectual boundaries. And also, I suppose it's protecting other people's beliefs as well, knowing when not to overstep their personal boundaries as well, that they've set.
That's a really good point, actually, isn't it? Because, when I was doing some work about boundary setting, one key thing that I forgot initially was everybody's boundaries are different, aren't they?
Precisely.
And like you said, especially when we're talking about really delicate subjects.
Absolutely.
Our beliefs may be different than somebody else's. So, I like that idea.
Particularly because of my political beliefs as well, I have to be so aware of that, because it makes me angry. I get so, and that's my own issues with it, really. I can quite judge others, about their political beliefs. And I really have to be aware of that, because it can be so toxic.
Because if you voice your opinion, then that other person's probably going to feel a bit violated, I would think.
Absolutely. And also, it's just, it's going to breed resentment and anger, which is so detrimental to our well-being.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially in relationships as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And in every environment, actually. So there's emotional boundaries, and these can be sort of the healthy aspect of this boundary is limiting what you share and your personal and sharing your own personal information. So at certain times in life, especially maybe at work, limiting what you share is quite important, I think, sometimes. But somebody violating that would be someone criticizing or belittling or invalidating another person's feelings. So that's your sort of opposite, the counter.
Yeah, that's
boundary.
Interesting.
Yeah. Another one which is particularly important is your, sexual boundaries. So a healthy boundary to create would be like a mutual understanding and respect of limitations and desires between sexual partners. Having that clear communication is so important. A violated boundary would be sort of unwanted sexual touch, pressure to engage in sexual acts, leering or sexual comments, so that's a violated boundary. There's also material boundaries. A healthy sort of boundary that you can set is by setting limits. Time for each facet of your life, such as work, relationships, and hobbies. A violated boundary would be where another person demands too much of your time. So you then need to set that boundary to protect your time, because time is precious, isn't it? So they're the types of boundaries. I wanted to say also about the healthy boundaries. So healthy boundaries can be the difference between a healthy, happy relationship and a toxic, dysfunctional relationship. But another thing that you need to be aware of is that there's not always a thing where the person's toxic. A person is not always necessarily toxic. It's the situation that can breed that
toxicity.
That's it. Yes. Exactly. So it's always an important part of a relationship to communicate, have an honest conversation about boundaries with people. I think this could have saved so many of my past relationships, to be perfectly honest. Just having that communication.
I think we're kind of getting to an area where I was going to ask you a little bit later as we go along. I think one of the key things for me in boundary setting is, well, it's not just this, but obviously understanding that boundaries are important, but it's actually communicating those boundaries effectively and from a place of kindness. When I was doing some work around this, I thought a lot of boundaries that I would like to put in are not particularly kind boundaries, or they might not be perceived as kind to somebody else, but they were kind to me. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
So boundaries, is so important and it's so complex. I'm really enjoying some of the stuff that you're sharing with me there. We'll go on to the next question. But if you're struggling to see us, I think we're actually back up and running now. I think we might have gone dark for a couple of minutes, hopefully not as long as that. That feels like a couple of minutes for me in April anyway, but we'll crack on. So if we could get the next question, and if it's not happening in the background, we'll change it here. And that's something I think we've already kind of alluded to, April, haven't we? What if people, I've had these situations, what if people continually overstep your boundaries? What kind of tips or tricks have you got?
Oh, wow. I've got some tips, but I suppose also it's recognizing when you've got that energy, because when you're in that real low state of mind, sometimes you haven't got the capacity, have you? But here's some tips anyway. So it's really important to have clarity. Being clear is kind. If boundaries are not set clearly, people can overstep these without knowing. That's a reality, isn't it?
That is really, really a reality in itself. And that links again back to what we were just talking about, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I found myself in some of my experiences is I didn't communicate my boundary very well.
No.
And I wasn't even aware that I was overstepping other people's boundaries.
Absolutely.
Which is really exactly what you're saying there, isn't it?
It just breeds resentment and anger. And volatility, really, doesn't it? Yeah. And the second, what we've harped on about is communication. So communicate your needs with kindness. We're not really taught about this as a child, are we? About how you create boundaries. It's not even a topic that I've ever spoken about really since other than coming to Ethiopia. It's not really something I've really focused on, other than sort of professional boundaries and knowing what I should share, what I shouldn't share. The boundaries you create between yourself and a service user, etc. It's so important. But I've never really thought about it in a sort of setting healthy boundaries for myself. I think it's incredibly important.
I like the point of you never really taught about setting boundaries. You kind of learn boundaries. I like the fact that you linked it to kind of a work environment, and there are boundaries that you kind of learn from the environment that you're in, and you're kind of oblivious to the kind of boundaries that you need to set for yourself.
Exactly.
I think that's a really good idea. And, I agree wholeheartedly. I don't think we're ever taught that. It's kind of just learnt as you go along.
Yeah.
But when you get later in life, and when you have things happen in your life, you get a realization that you need to have this line in the sand, if you want to call
Absolutely.
it. I often call boundaries, they are invisible.
Yeah.
but they need to be there, don't they?
Yeah.
And that's why I always call it an invisible line in the sand.
And I suppose the reality of life is you can't necessarily cut somebody out of your life, can you, completely?
No, you can't.
Sometimes, that's a real, reality for a lot of people. But what you can do for yourself is set clear boundaries for yourself, and, and hopefully the other person will start to respect that, especially if you do it in a proactive way.
Yes.
If you're not lashing out with resentment and anger, and that's what usually it breeds. But if you're doing it in your own guarded way, then hopefully that would be respected in the long run. And if it's not, then what's your advice on that? What if somebody continuously oversteps your boundary?
Well, again, I think this is very much about individuality, isn't it? And I like the fact that sometimes people can't cut people out of their lives, but some people can do that. And this is where the kind of personalization comes. And I kind of understand exactly where you were coming from. Is the boundary is important, but there's so many elements about that boundary that can either create issues or maybe alleviate those issues. When you're talking about relationships and toxic relationships and things like that, it might be that both individuals don't understand that. It might be that you're setting boundaries that go directly against your core beliefs, which is making you sad and unwell and resentful. But on the other hand, that person's boundaries might be the things that keep that person well. Is that making sense?
I do understand.
So there's this whole complexity, isn't there?
There is.
Excuse me. So I think it's really just relating to the subject. Boundaries are important. And when we've set a boundary, and if it's directly goes with our core beliefs, then there isn't that element of, when we said at the beginning, didn't we, about that flexibility?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's your absolute core belief or your core value, then there isn't a compromise. This is my view and my view only.
Absolutely.
There isn't a compromise there. And that is about communicating that. And going back to your question, if I had somebody, for instance, in my life, not, very close people, but if I had somebody in my life that I felt to be a friend or a trusted friend, but they were going directly against my core beliefs, then my response would be to that, would to be cut them.
Yeah, or distance yourself.
Or completely distance myself away from it until we get some kind of compromise.
Precisely.
Or we get a proper discussion about boundary settings. And, life is life.
Yeah.
To be fair, there are some people that will not change their viewpoint because it goes against their core values.
Precisely.
And that, for me, there's a mismatch.
Yeah.
And it's probably making that person unwell as much as it is making ourselves unwell.
That's it. That's the recognition there, isn't it? So with the third tip goes into consistency. People will start to recognize your boundaries, and it's something that will also get into your mind as well. You'll become more aware, and it'll be easy for you to then, just recognize when you need to set those boundaries. So consistency is so important.
Absolutely. I mean, I can just think of a couple of things that I've learned later in life is just because of the character that I am and the way that I was brought up in school and my friend circle. I was constantly using swear words, if you like, when I was engaging with other people. But it was just naturally me.
I know.
And it was only this one day that somebody said to me, Neil, can you please stop swearing, because it makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, you weren't aware of it.
And then all of a sudden you get that awareness, don't you? And I can still from time to time swear like a trooper, but when that person is there, I think I'm not going to do that today because that's going to upset that individual. So that really does kind of make sense in its entirety.
Definitely. So the fourth tip would be consent. So when you start to bend a boundary, ask yourself, is this okay with you? You don't always have to be rigid, but, just always ask yourself, is this okay with me? If I feel like you know, we're going to bend our boundaries a little bit. We need to really recognize, like what you said earlier about thinking, is this okay? Am I going over my beliefs? You know, am I totally disregarding my own beliefs here? Yeah.
So that was really what we were talking about then, wasn't it?
Exactly. So consent.
And I, you know, I have learned this, is if it goes against your belief system, then there isn't for me any compromise anymore, because it still kind of makes me feel unwell.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So there will be times when that flexibility, which you spoke about early in the conversation, has to come into play, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But as long as it doesn't go directly against your core values, because if you do that, you kind of,
you could slip back into bad habits, couldn't you?
You slip back without a doubt, and you're kind of protecting somebody else rather than protecting yourself. And you've heard the phrase as many times as I probably have. You tend to become a yes/no person.
Yeah, absolutely, you do.
Yeah. So
and that goes really against your self-confidence and self-esteem,
goes against,
doesn't it?
Yeah, and it makes you feel unwell.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things that we're talking about do create other mental health issues. We can find ourselves getting into sadness, which we know leads into depression. We can get ourselves where we're not comfortable of, you know, going in groups of people, for instance, which leads to anxiety. You know, and then if you're constantly, somebody's overstepping your boundaries, then that leads into low mood. So it's all kind of linked together, isn't it?
Ultimately. And the final tip is, you know, compassion. There's a little proverb, and it goes, good fences make good neighbours. And I really like this because I can picture it. Good boundaries don't need to be or feel unkind. They can be wonderful for the healing of relationships, robust, rewarding, and empowering. Yeah, and they can be, can't they? That's the reality.
What a great phrase that
I love
is
it.
To end our life.
Yeah.
That's really good. So hopefully, guys, and we will come towards the end now. So hopefully, you've learned something. Yes, please.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, please do.
There is a link to
shall we pop it up?
There's a link to a lovely podcast that I listened to this morning. It's
pop
only a
it
short one. It's not heavy, but it's about setting stronger boundaries. And yeah, some of the things that we spoke about this morning, this afternoon, is featured in that. So have a little listen in the sunshine this afternoon.
Well, there you go, guys. That's a perfect place to have a look and delve into a little bit more about effectively putting boundaries in place for your mental well-being.
Yeah.
So on that, it's been a joy, and thank you for watching. Don't forget, Isaropia. Please, if you've not heard of us, visit our website, isaropia.uk. You'll find lots of tips and tricks and information on that. If you're having mental health struggles and you live on the Isle of Wight, contact your GP, because your GP is able to refer you through. And we have a Facebook page, so those of you that are on Facebook, then please join our Facebook page. We constantly keep that updated. If anybody feels that they need some support and we're out of hours, then we do, and we will post it up for you. I would advise you to contact the crisis line or Safe Haven, but that information will be posted up after we've ended this stream. So thank you for your time, April. It's been a joy having a conversation with you.
Yeah, it's been wonderful.
And we'll see you all again next week. We do this on a weekly basis. I think the next one we'll be doing is next Thursday at 10 a.m. in the morning. And we'll post up all the information on our platforms for you to get involved in that. So thank you very much, and we'll see you later.